in, to acquire for the museum. And a lot of this thinking that I would, pass on to you tonight is probably based on experience, that I've gained over the last almost 20 years. I think first, working as an art historian, working as a critic, working as a curator, and in many cases trying to, I think first and foremost I consider myself an art lover. So then I try to sort of define what it is that I love about art. And oftentimes it's really the excitement about finding something new, the excitement about having my mind opened up to new experiences and to learn new things. And so my real mission, I guess, whether it's me writing about art, whether it's me kind of putting on exhibitions, is really trying to translate that excitement or open the doors to that excitement to a public. Whether it's a large public or a small public or whatever, but just, I've seen myself in some ways as kind of a proselytizer about contemporary art and wanting to show and talk about and foreground the best art that's being made today. And then, of course, when you set out to do something like that, you start to have to come up with ways to communicate what's good, what's bad, what's exciting, what's worthwhile, what's not. And so that's been, in many ways, kind of a process that I've been going through over the last 20 years, trying to come up with definitions that work, trying to come up with rationales and ways of making work that can be clear, that can be transparent, that makes me accountable in some way. So it's not just I know what I like when I see it kind of thing, but really kind of have some sort of rationale as to why this art is worth putting on the museum walls, why this art is worth writing about, why this art is perhaps worth spending somebody else's, usually not my own, money on in order to bring it into a museum, for eternity probably. And one of the things that I've found to be most useful lately, or an analog or an analogy, is really thinking about art, or I should say artists, as comparable to advanced researchers in, say, medicine or maybe mathematics or physics, which I think on the one hand allows us to accept a certain professionalism that I think has really crept into the art world and has, I think, clarified it in a lot of ways, and which is something that didn't used to be. It used to be more mysterious, and artists just went into their studios and made things, and hopefully amazing things would come out. With the proliferation of art schools over the last 50 years, really, since the GI Bill, I guess, after World War II, the art world has become more and more professionalized with, of course, MAs and MFAs and things, BFAs and all of those sort of degrees, which I think for a lot of people at first maybe seemed like it was taking some of the mystery and mystique out of art, but I actually think, or have come around to appreciate the fact that this is the best way for artists to gain a certain kind of critical approach to their work that allows them to know what they're doing, that allows them to know what's been done around them or what's been done in history, and in many cases nowadays too, to really equip them with the tools to help to deliver their art to the world. And one of the things that I think makes sense about this idea of an artist today being some kind of advanced visual or perceptual researcher is, I think, one also for general audiences allows, it justifies why we would pay attention to these artists and why you would come to a museum or a gallery. Well, it's to kind of find out what is going on at the advanced flanks of culture, where visual art is being pioneered, and as opposed to reading about these things in some kind of specialized journal, art has the fantastic outlet of places like galleries and museums, and it's primarily visual. So these are things that can be shared in many cases without the need for a lot of text and reading and things like that. The other thing that I like about this comparison or this model is that it also, if you were an advanced mathematician or something, you would know everything that had been done in your field already up to that point. You knew what all the research was, where all the breakthroughs were, and it was your job to then kind of push your field to the next step, at least if you wanted to be a mathematician of any kind of note. And I think that's really the burden that artists bear today too, is to, if you're a sculptor, to know everything that's happened in sculpture and figure out where you can actually uniquely contribute to that tradition and push it forward in a new way. And for me, one thing that I grapple with is well, why do I always want to see something new? What is it about newness that motivates the art world so much? And is this quest for newness a superficial quest, or is there something more meaningful to it? And I think, again, using this analogy of kind of research in the sciences and everything, what we're looking for, or what I think I'm looking for, is a breakthrough every time. Every time I see something different, it probably means that it hasn't been done before, and that this artist knows where the field is and is pushing it to a new boundary or a new limit. And so that's where these epiphanies can come from, where this newness can come from. And so I think it helps to really quantify that. And by the same token, I think it's a tool or a comparison or analogy, whatever you might want to call it, that also allows, I think, for a certain amount of objectivity on the part of people like myself, who can, again, kind of go back to some kind of record of achievements and compare this object, this offering, to those other achievements and sort of judge it to see whether the things have been pushed forward or whether that marker has been moved. So I think it tends to bring a certain objectivity to that practice of judging art and determining what's good. And in this age of I think increasing transparency and increasing accountability on the part of curators and museums, that it really allows us to explain what it is people are seeing, why this is important to look at or pay attention to, and why this art is being shown as opposed to the hundreds of thousands of other things that are being made out there that didn't quite make this cut or kind of proceed to this level. So those are the kinds of things that I have in mind when I go out looking at art, and whether that's in a studio visit with an artist one-on-one, whether that's just walking into a gallery with absolutely no idea what I'm going to see at that moment, or whether I'm going into a museum, is hopefully having this knowledge and this background of what's happened up to this point, and then being surprised by something, if it's a good outcome, or being let down by something which which is something that probably I've already seen before or done a million times before, or something like that. So I think it also helps to account for this jaded quality that so many of us that have been hanging around art for a long time might have, of kind of, oh, been there, done that, seen that. It's because these are probably reiterations of things that we've already processed in some way already, and we're looking for that next thing. And the thing that also I think is useful about thinking about art this way is that it does privilege breakthrough. It does privilege experimentation. It privileges people that are willing to go out on a limb, do something that nobody else has done before. It allows musicians to come into the equation, which is something that for me really oftentimes sets of ambition, that somebody's really trying to hit a home run out of the park with this art object, rather than just merely getting by. And so it I think both brings the quality of objectivity to the discussion, but it also allows for this sense of wonder that we all feel when we know that we're in the presence of something truly fantastic and magnificent, just as maybe a mathematician would when he or she sees some kind of new equation or theorem that tends to kind of explain everything for that moment and bring a moment of clarity to your life or to that particular field. So when I'm in there in a studio visit in particular, I want to know that artist knows what he or she is doing, that they know that this type of painting has been done this way before, and and I'm going to do it this way, to really be as big of a geek as possible on that particular topic or that field or tradition that they're working in, and know more than I know about that, so that when I go in there, I'm learning something, and I know that this artist is a real caretaker of that tradition and is willing to kind of take it forward to the next level. And this is, I do see increasingly in these people that are true fanatics about the that they're working in and know what's been done and where to push it. And I think in this day and age of the internet, so much of this material is increasingly at people's fingertips and do this research. And you know, of course, travel is key, and I guess in some ways, you know, travel has been made easier or less expensive than before, but it's still, you know, pretty expensive to get out there and go around the world in exhibitions and visiting with artists. But the internet, I think, really gives one less excuse for somebody not knowing about what's going on out there. If you really want to be a contributor, you know what everybody else is doing. And I think that also, you know, on the one hand can lead to a certain generic international homogenization of the art world, but it also could, I think, if used correctly, allow somebody to recognize what is really special and unique and kind of maybe regionally inflected with what they're doing, something that could, for instance, only exist in Chicago perhaps, or only exist in Los Angeles, or take advantage of certain references and resources and a vernacular language that maybe exists in that place, which can help to differentiate a painting that's made in Chicago from a painting that's made in Dallas. And that is also something that I look for, because there is a certain kind of slick art forum approved kind of art object that circulates around there in the world that you can tell has kind of checked all the right boxes and looks a certain way and has all the kind of references that people are looking for, but yet still feels a little bit hollow or superficial in some way or another. So I am a firm believer in trying to pick up on some of these unusual quirks and idiosyncrasies of a place, and how that also can bear on what you're doing and lead to something, again, that is very unique and hopefully will set your practice apart from somebody else. So some of those things that I tend to really look for is, one, you know, really knowing what the state of the field is and how you're working within that, and then two, the sense of ambition that you are willing to kind of take that and run with it and do something, you know, really truly new and exciting, even if it's absolutely beyond your means, beyond the capabilities of your studio. At least if you're trying or pushing it to that degree, I think that's something to really strive for. And it's something that when I was living in Los Angeles throughout or near and around Los Angeles in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, it's one of the things that I think really characterized the LA art scene, is this sense of ambition, the sense of kind of being willing to sort of do anything in order to advance your art. And that's something that was passed down from artists in the art schools themselves, places like UCLA, where you had Charlie Ray and you had Paul McCarthy and you had Richard Jackson and people like that were teaching artists like Jason Rhodes and others that were willing to just sort of go to wild extremes in order to make their art. And that kind of, again, drive and ambition really characterized that scene, and I think elevated the level of discourse in the art world in general, because there was a certain desire to really, you know, bring your name when it comes to showing the power itself. So that's something that I think is never to be counted. And you know, sometimes that ambition doesn't have to show itself just in sheer virtuosity. It doesn't necessarily mean it's pure scale. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's some kind of quotient of time that's measurable that's been put into this work, which you often find in certain work that displays a kind of obsessive quality, where if you make 20,000 brush strokes to make that painting, all of a sudden it has this sort of seriousness to it. But oftentimes that ambition could be in the form of scope of the project that you're taking on, that maybe it has this dimension that you can imagine extending for long periods of time, and that will cover all kinds of different territory and content. Which, in a way, I guess, brings me to one of the other criteria that I'm always really looking for in an artist's work, and that's growth. One of the things that I find to be the most deadening about contemporary art is sameness, and people that hit upon a certain kind of gimmick, maybe, or something that might possibly feel like a breakthrough at the beginning, or might really be quite unique and exciting, but then continue to return to that gesture over and over and over again. And oftentimes in this art world, those kinds of ways of working are really rewarded. There's a certain Wall Street hedge fund collector mentality that really respects a signature gesture that their colleague can recognize when they come visit their Park Avenue apartment, and then that they see when they go and visit their hedge fund friend in Paris or whatever. So there's this certain signature style that's definitely rewarded in the commercial art world, but that I think ends up being terribly boring, and is not the kind of art that you want to see brought back together for a retrospective, because there are no chapters. There is very little kind of difference from one body of work to the next, and those are the kinds of things that I'm often looking for. And sometimes with a younger artist, you might not actually see that growth or that progression from one body of work to the next, because maybe there only is one body of work so far. In which case, maybe I'd be inclined to kind of wait a little bit longer just to see where it's going. But oftentimes I can tell just by talking to artists, getting a sense of, again, the kind of scope of what they're after, that there is growth potential in the work, and that they can continue to diversify this practice and continue to add to it and grow to it. And so I'm always curious to see how artists maybe can build that growth potential into the work from the beginning, because oftentimes it's very obvious to see that they've hit upon this thing that they can continue to keep doing, and they're very willing to keep doing that, and could really lead to a trap that would be very difficult to get out of. So I really admire artists that are willing to kind of, even if they hit upon something that's very commercially successful and has real popular appeal, that they're willing to kind of abandon that once it gets boring for them and move on to the next thing, because that's the way that I think that really good artists sort of stay on that edge and continue to kind of push forward, which is staying away from that comfort zone. Excuse me while I take a quick sip of water. And one of the things that I do, excuse me, do continue to hear from artists, especially ones that I really admire, is this sense of wanting to keep themselves away from this comfort zone, keep themselves in this slightly uncomfortable, slightly self-conscious, and maybe even what's what I'm looking for, but kind of insecure position, because it's there that this real kind of energy comes from. And so oftentimes, say, maybe a painter that's really good at portraits but has no knowledge about doing landscapes will do a landscape just to kind of find that edge and kind of struggle with that and kind of try to break through. And I really respect when I kind of hear that kind of motivation coming from artists too, that they're looking for ways to keep themselves in that very creative zone of not knowing exactly what they're doing. And this is something that I hear from savvy young artists, but also from artists that are in their 60s and 70s and still charging along, that they want to keep making art, and oftentimes they keep doing it at a high level because they keep themselves in that area of anxiety. I'm usually pretty terrible at remembering kind of quotes that people have mentioned to me, or that that I read, and kind of being able to regurgitate them. But one thing that I do remember, Dave Hickey, the art critic, telling me one time is that, if I can get this right, because I already told you that I'm bad about this, but I think he said, anxiety is consciousness. And so I think he was getting at the same idea, that staying in that position where you don't really know what you're doing, you're makes you mentally focused and you're aware of what's going on, and that's often when you can really have these kinds of breakthroughs. So those are, in many ways, the kind of things that I return to over and over again, is this idea of looking for growth, looking for change, and making sure that this is an artist that I can imagine kind of developing well over the decades and making fantastic work all along. And that's not to say that things don't happen that might interrupt that. That's not to say that somebody that's making really boring work is not going to have this breakthrough and kind of change course. And I try to think of myself as being very open-minded and willing to kind of keep watching artists and art that I might find to be not terribly exciting now, with the hopes that maybe it will get more exciting later, and never kind of write anybody off altogether, because things do happen, and sometimes people do change things up to make things good. And the other side of it, though, is that oftentimes artists that look incredibly promising and that you're very excited about end up kind of just running into a corner and not being able to get out and exciting, which is, of course, for someone like me at a museum where you're trying to identify the kinds of things that you're willing to put money down on and bring into a museum collection with the idea that it's there in perpetuity, becomes a little bit more risky, and you really want to try to bet on the right horse that's going to continue to make good work and that you're going to be proud to have in the museum's collection. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is, even with all this sort of notion of wanting to find the best art that's being made, of looking for artists that are pushing the field forward, there are other factors that also come into play, especially with museum curators like myself that work at museums that do have collections, which is that you inherit this whole body of work when you come to a museum that already has a certain history, that might already have certain strengths, certain narratives and things like that in that collection as it is. And some art that you might really like sometimes just doesn't fit with that. It might not have any connection to what's already there. It might not be able to build on some of these narratives. And I actually think that's okay. It's not be work that's right for that museum, but might be right for some other place. And I think once one realizes that, it really allows you again to play up on these peculiarities of a place and how a museum has grown over time, whether that's through the intervention of curators, whether that's through the gifts and patronage of collectors over time that have given things to a museum. Hopefully along the way that collection has accumulated lots of examples that come from that city where that museum is located. And again, if we're able to kind of draw on those things and bring those out, again, I think it'll allow somebody that comes to, say, the MCA in Chicago, recognizes that they're in a very fundamentally different place than if they were going to see the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, or whether they were going to be at MoMA in New York or something. Just those kind of regional quirks really make this interesting and make it fun. And once things start to become more of a cookie cutter repetition from place to place to place, it really kind of becomes very boring very quickly. So that's something that I've tried to encourage and bring forth in museums that I've worked for. And also really one of the reasons I think that it's very fun to be at a collecting institution, because you inherit this incredible, crazy quilt of materials that you then have to kind of work with and interpret and even be willing to kind of bend your own ideas about what's important about art to fit this new reality. So, I mean, one example, even from my recent move from Seattle to Chicago, is when I moved to Seattle, I had no knowledge about the studio glass movement. So people like Dale Chihuly and Ginny Ruffner and William Morris and all these folks that really were, born and bred in the Seattle area, in that culture, and were important there, but really weren't that important in the context that I worked in Los Angeles, and now, coming to the MCA in Chicago, are also not part of that history. But I've inherited this new group of important artists that, again, in some cases I didn't know that much about it, and some of the Chicago imagists, I knew maybe some of the most well-known people, like whether it's Leon Golub or Ed Paschke or Jim Nutt, but I didn't know about Christina Ramberg. I didn't really know about Gladys Nilsson. I didn't know about Carl Worsom. And so learning about these people has been fantastic. And I think there's a potential for those collections to really set us apart from other places in other parts of the world, which I think is really exciting and renewing. One of the other things that Paul wanted me to talk about, in addition to some of these criteria that I kind of usually hold in my head as I'm walking around, is where and how I find out about artists. And of course, for me, when working at a museum, I tend to try not to kind of hang around art schools too much and look at artists that are too young or still in school. Even though if I was a collector, I would probably do that and just to kind of see what's out there and keep tabs on that. It's not an area that I think that there can be too much pressure put on young artists if museum curators are sniffing around at their MFA shows. And I would, again, want to sort of see the work grow a bit more before it's something that I would want to put on view at the museum or certainly buy for the museum. But I think galleries are absolutely crucial in our art ecosystem. I think for me, galleries are often the places that kind of can be that first filter, that would be the ones that would find artists from grad school, hopefully nurture them along, put them on view at their museum, and then allow it, kind of sift through all of the art that's being made out there and deliver hopefully good work that people like I can kind of then find, or collectors can find, or other people can find. The one challenge, of course, is, finding dealers that have the same standards that you do. And so I think that's one of the most crucial things to look for in a dealer, is somebody that's really putting together a rigorous program that is making choices based on the quality of the work, making choices based on artists that might have something to do with one another, and whether that's kind of a career point or certain concerns in the work. But I really look for and kind of single out galleries that have put together a rigorous program and aren't just sort of filling it with fluff that can be easily sold, but really finding people that are pushing things forward. And it is more rare than you would think to find galleries that have a very consistent standard from artist to artist in their program. And but that is something that I tend to look for and really value. And then in those cases, really value those opinions of those dealers who are out there holding these artists to the same kind of standards that I would want to hold them to when I'm, making decisions for the museum. And so I tend to, in many cases, really trust and look to certain dealers to kind of give me advice on new artists that are coming up, or ask for tips of who's interesting, in addition to people that they're showing in their own gallery program. And I tend to do that through traveling. Of course, here in Chicago, I would do it with the galleries that are here. As I'm traveling, I would try to sit down with some of these better galleries and find out what they're showing, even if I hadn't seen their recent shows. And then increasingly, art fairs, even though they're often a horrible place to look at art and to really get a sense of who an artist really is, across multiple examples of their work, it is a great place for someone like me to network with dealers, to kind of catch up with what they're doing, to maybe look back at photo documentation of shows that I maybe have missed, to get a sense of who they're working with and who might be worth keeping track of in the future. So that kind of network of dealers is really important. I assume, that art magazines are another place to at least sort of keep tabs on what's going on out there in the world, although I have to admit that I haven't been reading art magazines quite as regularly as I would like to, probably. But the other absolutely tried and true place that I look for artists, or try to find new artists to become aware of, is from other artists that I respect. So, which makes it all the more important, I think, for an artist working today to really maintain a certain network of friends and peers that that you look up to, that you might have common goals and common values with, because if a curator or a dealer comes to see that artist, that same artist might then refer this dealer, curator, whoever, to your studio, knowing that you, again, are kind of making good work and doing things like that. So that kind of artist network that often starts in graduate school can be a really useful tool. And I think it's also something, that's great to maintain in terms of getting feedback from your peers and things like that, which often people, really find a vacuum after they graduate from school, not having all those students, not having all those teachers looking over their shoulder. And that kind of network of artist friends can be really crucial, I think, in keeping you on your toes and keeping you fresh. So that's something to really pay attention to. Of course, if you don't go to the kind of hippest, coolest art school in town and don't have those same contacts, I know it can be difficult. Or if you move from one city to another and you don't have that same network. I have known artists that have found it hard to try to replicate that network. In that situation, I guess it's just a matter of trying to get out there and meet people and things like that, maybe through art openings and other lectures and things like that. But again, it's something that I think is really crucial, that artist-to-artist network. One little bit of advice that I think is worth mentioning is, we get cold calls all the time, people sending in packets of information all the time, and I think it's probably a big waste of time, because oftentimes, the level of quality of the material that comes in usually is so bad that we become kind of hardened to the fact that there's almost nothing good that ever comes in that way. So I would definitely encourage people to not write kind of form letters to museums saying, I would like to have a show in your museum, because things usually don't work out that way. It's usually, showing at a gallery, or having an artist recommend your work, and kind of these interpersonal connections and kind of networks of trust, really, I think, and shared values that tend to kind of make these connections. And likewise, kind of just going up to a curator or a critic and saying, please write about my show, or please give me a show, also usually doesn't work. Things tend to be more subtle, and it usually is about the work itself, not some kind of a personal appeal. And I really like it when I come to work without knowing the artist, or having a kind of a personal or connection that has to do with personality or anything, coming to the work on its own and appreciating it, and then hopefully coming to get to know that artist. So having a certain sort of standoffish quality, and not being a salesperson, not being kind of in people's face trying to force them to look at your work, can be a good strategy, and I think is definitely a better strategy than being out there as a wheeler and dealer and really trying to to kind of force the issue. I think you've got to use really subtle means to get the curator, critic, dealer, whoever to look at the work without being terribly obvious or beating them over the head with it. So that would be one of my kind of simpler bits of advice that I could pass on in a situation like this. Trying to see if there's anything else that is worth mentioning here.
I think that's been really wonderful, Michael. I've muted everybody because there was a fair amount of background noise, and I've muted I think just about everybody but you and me. Now I'm unmuting everyone, and I think we got a bit of an echo. Bob, did you have a question? No.
Oh, I'd be very happy to be open to questions now.
Fabulous. All right.
I have a question.
All right, Andrew, yes.
So, I guess, thank you very much for being here and doing all this. How often do you visit artist studios in your process of finding people that you maybe want to give a show, say a 12 by 12 or whatever else there is that might be a possibility at the museum?
I mean, one of my biggest challenges is just kind of breaking away from the kind of busy work of the museum and keeping track of all the things going on in order to get out into the studios. And so in an ideal case, it'd be great if I kind of got a studio visit in one per week at least. It's probably not quite that pace right now, although hopefully after I kind of settle into a bit more of a schedule, I can do that. But it is definitely one of the most rewarding and most fun parts of the job, and absolutely where I learn more than I do from reading an art magazine or reading a catalog or a book. Is that kind of information that I get from an artist in the studio. I would say though that more and more, because of constraints of time and things like that, I do like to kind of have a sense of what I'm going to go see in a studio, or what that artist is about before I just sort of sign on to any old blind studio visit, because it's just difficult to find the time, and I really want to try to be a bit more focused. So I kind of rarely kind of just say yes to a studio invitation without knowing a little bit about that artist already, and making sure that it's the kind of work that that looks promising, even if there's still a lot of questions about it. I want to make sure that I'm not wasting my time or wasting the time of that artist by going over there. But I think in an ideal case, a couple studio visits per month would be a good start for me right now.
That would be kind of anywhere, right? I mean, you travel around to do these things. I guess my part of that, the follow-up question to that is, how do you determine when you're going to actually be able to do that? Because I understand you have a lot of time constraints and you're busy and whatever. What leads you up to actually doing that? I mean, that seems to me like that might be kind of like a deal closer in some way. So I'd be curious what that would be that would lead you up to actually doing it.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. And you're right. I do, when I travel, tend to work in studio visits too. So if I was just in New York and I did a couple studio visits on that trip, and when I was in London earlier in the fall and I did studio visits then. So it's something that I do try to factor into all of my trips, is getting out and seeing artists and seeing studios. Oftentimes, it might just be out of pure curiosity. Maybe I've seen a show by that artist, and then want to follow up and go do a studio visit, just to kind of again get into the artist's head a little bit, understand what motivates them, because that oftentimes is that deciding factor, whether this is just a flash in the pan or whether there's something more sustained and serious going on there. So it can be just seeing a show, it can be an artist that I've always wanted to visit maybe, and I happen to be going to their home city, and so I schedule a visit with them. Sometimes it might be I might be doing research towards an exhibition, and I come up with a list of artists that might be candidates for that show, and then I systematically go out and do studio visits with them. So it's kind of all sorts of different motivations, but it really doesn't mean that I'm going to give them a show, or it's not that last test like you said about this is the deal closer to give somebody a show. Oftentimes it's just out of pure curiosity and wanting to know what they're doing and why they're doing it, and then hopefully I'll hang on to that information, and hopefully it'll become useful at another point. Oftentimes it might not even be useful to me, but I can kind of tip off another curator, another collector, a dealer coming through town saying, well, so-and-so is making this fantastic work that I think you might like, and go see it. So oftentimes it's just being a conduit that I think is a really unspoken part of being a curator. Is allowing information about artists in particular and galleries maybe to pass through you to other people, which might allow them to do something. So I find that to be just as rewarding in some cases as doing something, doing a show or something myself is maybe enabling somebody else to see something that they wouldn't have seen otherwise. So
fabulous, Michael. Thank you very much for your generosity. Are there other questions? I love it. You covered absolutely everything. I think you really said a lot in depth. I've got a couple of questions.
Okay.
Do you think you can distinguish anything among Chicago artists that unifies them? I mean, I can venture first, if you like. I mean, I think there's a work ethic that exists here that's the extension of the blue-collar ethic that, you know, Chicago has sort of been famous for since maybe 1830, you know, and that it's the work ethic of the people that imbues the work ethic of the artists. Your turn.
Well, you know, I think I am starting to sense a real kind of braininess, maybe, about a lot of the Chicago art I'm seeing. You know, people that do seem to be taking things really seriously, really kind of understanding, again, the traditions that they're working in, and trying to come up with ways of adding to that. And often there's I don't know, I'm sensing kind of a pretty high kind of intellectual content in a lot of the work that I've been seeing, and some of it's by young artists that are just coming out of the art schools. Unfortunately, in some cases, people that are coming out of the art schools and then leaving Chicago for other places, which is a problem that I want to try to get a handle on. But for instance, I just saw this show in New York over the weekend by a young artist named Valerie Snowbeck, who apparently is a recent University of Chicago graduate, and it was really smart stuff and really adventurous, and you know, it seems consistent with other things that I've been seeing, you know, around that leads me to believe that there's some, you know, really good stuff going on in terms of teaching and what students are thinking about and looking at and everything. So, that's the quality that I'm sensing so far, is kind of real smart and intellectual quality to a lot of the art I'm seeing.
Okay, fabulous. I got one other question, but anybody else want to ask a question before we let Michael go? I think this has been fabulously valuable.
I have a question.
Yes, is that Teresa?
Teresa, you just were talking about being adventurous, and you mentioned that earlier. So I'm wondering if you find adventurous related to a particular type of media. Like, do you find more technological medias, or having more of a sense of adventure, painting? You know, what would you identify it in any particular media?
Interesting question.
Yeah, not really. I mean, I do try to be very open-minded about that and kind of look for that sense of adventurousness in painting and sculpture and photography and video, whatever it might be. And so, yeah, I try to really look for that in any of those media without finding. I'd say maybe if there was one field that seemed to be a bit more open than others, it might be sculpture, just because maybe there are more possibilities there in some way, and you might find a wider range of expression than you would maybe in photography or painting in particular, and maybe even video, perhaps just because those three tend to be confined to a pretty standard format in a way. But I wouldn't, you know, but I see great stuff in all of those different media all the time. So I don't know if there's any one that, you know, seems more appropriate than another for finding that sense of wonder and adventure.
All right. Again, this has been outstanding. Michael, thank you so much. Anybody a last shot? Michael, I have a question for you, and I think we should answer it to me privately. How do you feel about having this transcribed and putting it to some kind of, you know, use for either you or for me or the museum or whatever? You want to answer me later? You want to go right ahead right now?
No, I think you can go for it. I mean, you know, I really like to be able to sort of, you know, share these insights so that hopefully they're helpful to somebody. And again, you know, just trying to be accountable for the sort of opinions that we put forth and accountable for what we put on view at the museum. And so, I think it's absolutely fair and safe and everything else to try to, get this out into the world however you want to use it.
Wow, I really applaud everything you've contributed, and I applaud your attitude, and I think you're making a big, solid difference to Chicago, and, I think it reinforces Madeline's agenda, and I can see Bob up there clapping. I'm proud of what you're doing, and I'm proud of what it brings to Chicago, and I think it's a great place to have it done, too. So, thank you very much for participating with us. Thank you. Good night.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay.
All right.
Thank
You're welcome.